Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So perhaps you're like me in the way that you feel something is just off about this country. It's everywhere you look. But one area that you can certainly see it is if you look into the schools and you look into the youth. You look at the ideologies that have taken over our youth. You look at the ideologies of most of the teachers that are teaching our youth. And specifically as it comes down to gender and gender identity, you look at the rates of kids identifying as LGBTQ, you look at the White House and their massive push for this stuff, and you have to wonder what's the driving thing behind it. Obviously, there's some sort of class warfare going on. It seems like they're trying to make us angry. Anybody who's not really, not really against it, but maybe not full, all for it. So you're putting up pride flags in your profile on Facebook. They're trying to divide us into people who are either for or against, right? These are, communist tactics. And so joining us today is James Lindsay, an author, speaker. He's starring in an upcoming documentary, which we'll be talking about, called Beneath Sheep's Clothing. But we're going to be dissecting this social engineering, what's behind it, what is the end goal. It's going to be a fascinating interview where we're going to be touching upon a lot of different subjects to try to put together a picture of what is really, really going on here. What's the end goal? And is it working or is it failing? So folks, please enjoy the interview with James Lindsay. Mr. James Lindsay, it is an honor to have you on the show. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hey, yeah, it's my pleasure.
So one phenomenon I think that we've seen in the United States, probably more acutely in the past 5 years, and specifically under the Biden administration, which we've seen evidence with the push for LGBTQ within the White House and even highlighting the guests and everything like that, is that we're seeing this wave of whether it's homosexuality or transgenderism or really the LGBTQ plus alphabet sweeping our nation, but specifically the schools. We've now got, I think in NFL, there's now a gay football league that's been announced. I mean, we're seeing it in every area, and especially with it being Pride Month, right? You're seeing it all over the place, even more so. And while it seems like it's maybe some sort of reaction to oppression, or it's a freedom of rights being celebrated, similar to the anti-war movement in the 60s, once you dig down, you realize that the drivers behind it aren't just natural social phenomena. There's actually a very concrete agenda that's pushing it. And this is something that I think that is absolutely your expertise, is understanding the agenda, what's happening, what's behind it, what it's doing. And so we're talking about a few things, but you have a recent book that we'll be hitting on, a movie that's also coming out soon, which is also tied to it. So just kind of handing it to you, when you look at this movement that's happening in America, is it natural? Is it, the rate of children now identifying as LGBTQ, is that just a social phenomenon? What are you seeing happening behind all this?
Yeah, no, it's not natural. It's certainly not natural. This is something that is being done to us. It is not something that is merely happening. It has what we might call emergent properties. It's kind of like once you put the pressure on the population, certain things will start to happen naturally. Mostly once you align the incentive structures in a particular way, people will go on their own in those directions. And some of those incentives are, kind of very just basic corruption. And some of them are, more of the almost Chinese brainwashing style, where you have to fit into your social group in order to be able to continue to have a fully, absolutely fulfilling life, to be able to participate fully in society, I guess is what I was really trying to say. But let's unpack a bunch of things in that right away before we get into the kind of meat of this. First of all, for example, last year I predicted that last year would be kind of the last real Pride Month, and I think that that's actually true. It is Pride Month technically now. It's also Juneteenth, apparently, on the day that we happen to be recording, which means when you put these two things together, nobody knew either one of these things was really happening. I mean, we kind of got like a sense at Pride Month, but compare it to the last 2 or 3 years. It's like really muted. And I think that is because they overplayed their hand over the last 2 years in particular, with the lead up to Pride last year being kind of inaugurated by this transgender shooter at a Christian school in Nashville. And of course, that manifesto has now leaked, and there's a lot of drama. It looks like people are going to get in a lot of maybe legal trouble because the desperation to cover up that thing, that manifesto is has been so high. But I digress. I think that we're actually watching the death throes of Pride Month. Like, it's going to kind of carry on in this weird zombie fashion, but I think it's mostly over. But let's talk about the alphabet acronym LGBTQIA plus hot dog emoji, whatever you want. This is actually fake. Let's be real controversial right up front. LGBTQ is fake. What do I mean by that? L, those are lesbians. Those are people. Those are real. G, those are gays. Those are people. Those are real. B, those are bisexuals. Those are people. Those are real. T, there are actually two T's, and we don't talk about the two T's because the woke don't like one of the T's, and they're conflated into one. There's transsexual and there is transgender. And they're not exactly the same thing. Transsexual are people who, for whatever set of reasons, usually confessed mental health disorders, found that the best way to deal with their concerns, their issues, their fetishes, whatever it might be, is to attempt to live life as the opposite sex. Transgender operates in this realm of gender ideology, which means that it's not about the individual trying to sort out their admitted problems. It is now about trying to convince society to make real. The technical term for this is to reify, make fakely real, to reify the idea that one's gender is detached from sex and is completely mutable and up to a matter of subjective determination about one's inner feelings. So there are two T's, and one of those are a kind of very a group of people that are in a bad place because they're admittedly extremely strange and they're upsetting and destabilizing in certain ways, but they're also people who are openly admitting that they're coping with something the best they know how. And then you have this agenda driven transgender movement, which is actually rooted in the Q, and Q is queer. And queer, it turns out, is not people. Queer is politics. The definition of queer in David Halperin's book, St. Foucault, starts with unlike gay identity, which means it's not like gay identity. And what Halperin says the difference is between gay and queer is that gay is rooted in a positive truth, which means it's real, and queer is not rooted in any positive truth or any stable reality. He says there's nothing to which it necessarily refers. He says it's an identity without an essence. It is defined in its actual nature as its, what does he call it? His positionality. It's a person's positionality. In other words, politics vis-a-vis the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. And his definition of queer is it is that which is whatever. He says that's in italics, whatever. It is whatever is opposed to the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. And then he goes on to say that it's not just deviances and perversions and fetishes and all this other stuff. It's not even people who are necessarily marginalized because of their sexual practices, but it's people who are also who feel that they are marginalized. So they can imagine, oh, I have some weird thing. I watched something on the internet. I kind of got into it. It's really strange. People would judge me if they found out. Oh, now you're queer. And so now what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to adopt this very radical politics against normalcy and legitimacy itself, which is an acid. We've often heard the phrase universal acid. It's a universal acid that dissolves anything, because the second you say, well, here's the new vanguard, this is what's normal now, here's a new normal, it's normal. And queer is defined as whatever is opposed to the normal. So now you have to oppose the new thing. So it is literally, Q is literally a doctrine of perpetual revolution. So LGB, we're going to dither on the T and then Q. These are fundamentally different things. So what this actually is that LGB, and we can argue about T, are shields for Q. Q is hiding behind, just like when in the 1950s or late 1940s, I should say, when the communists took over China under Mao's direction, they would round up the peasants in the various villages and in the various counties as they marched through provinces to go take something else. Then they would take the villagers as they went along and the peasants, and they would put them in front of the army and make them carry the army's gear so that the nationalists, the Kuomintang forces, would have to there's these stories about them just firing their gun till their hand went numb, shooting into a sea of innocent people who were carrying the communist thing. Okay, so that sea of innocent people are your LGB and T kind of, in the Q are the communists pushing behind. And they are forcing people to get angry at homosexuality, to get angry at the idea of gay marriage, to get angry at the idea of gay civil rights and equality, because they're hiding behind those things as human and political shields to push an extraordinarily radical agenda that, even if you actually talk to most gay activists don't even agree with the queer agenda. And so that's a complicated enough topic on its own to merit, 10 shows. But it's very important for people to realize the LGB part of that acronym are human shields. And behind the human shields are radical communists using queer theory, which is a derived Marxist ideology, to try to upset the entire apple cart of society. And of course, what's going to be the result? Well, they're the only ones who know what's legitimately queer, right? So here's an example. So we have Ketanji Brown Jackson sitting at the Supreme Court. Marsha Blackburn says, "Can you define woman?" Ketanji Brown Jackson says, "No, I can't. I'm not a biologist," by which she means I'm not an expert, which means we have to defer to an expert. We have to ask an expert to figure out if you're a man or a woman, which is the most basic premise of reality. And the experts in this case are not biologists. The experts that are relevant in this case are gender theorists and queer theorists. So what that means is the queer theorists are pushing, like I said, with human shields in front of them to take over cultural institutions, and they set themselves up as the only true arbiters of what is real and what is not, down to the level of male and female. Here's an example. Imagine that Donald Trump got up on a stage tomorrow at an next rally and he says, "Hey, everybody, I'm for the next, whatever few months, I'm going to identify as a woman, and I'm going to be the first female president. I'm going to be the first transgender president." You can imagine this, or imagine he had done it when he was in office for 5 minutes. He came out on the balcony of the White House. He looks up at the sun, he squints his eyes, and he says, "I'm going to be a woman for the next 5 minutes, and then after that way I'll have been the first female president, and I'll have been deal with that, Hillary Clinton, and then I'll be the first transgender president. So deal with that, Michelle Obama." And then, I'm just joking, by the way, and maybe. And then imagine what they would say. He wasn't legitimate, right? They have the capacity to decide whether it's real or not. And there's actually a silly piece of evidence, but there's a piece of evidence backing this up. There's another guy out here in the world, Zuby. He's a rapper. He's from, well, I know him from the UK. I think he's from a lot of places, but he was from the UK when I met him, at least. And Zuby, at one point, he's a gym rat. He's a buff dude. And so he's strong. And he calculated that for his weight category, that if he were to do the deadlift at what he can 1 rep max, then he would have the world record in female deadlifting. So he identified as a woman on camera for 3 minutes, deadlifted the thing, broke the world record, set it down. Turns out nobody's recognized this about him whatsoever, because they have the ability, uniquely, the Qs have the ability to tell who's really sincere, to really pull the communist word. The Chinese communist word for it was that you have to express sincerity in your socialism. They know who's really sincere and who really isn't. And therefore, what they are doing is setting themselves up as the arbiters of reality for everybody. And like you said, with the schools in particular, all this, imagine that you would just now pictured all that nightmare for adults, now put it into 6-year-old. And that's what they're doing in the schools.
Insane. So there's a lot to unpack here. I want to pull this up quickly, which is, this is only up until 2022. This is on Statista, that you're saying 7.2% of U.S. adults identify as LGBT. Here, if you look though at Gen Z, they're saying it's, as of 2022, it's around 20%, roughly 1 in 5. I'm sure that if I found the 2023, 2024 statistics, it would have been most likely continuing to go up. But I want to unpack a few things that you've said there, because it's helpful for me, that in how you present it, is that LGBT, are people, they're individuals. I know lesbians, I know gay people. I don't necessarily know any trans people, that come to mind. I probably have met them. And yeah, they're individuals, right? Yeah. And so, that basically that queer though becomes the wild card, right? And this is, it's 1984, it's holding two opposing ideas. It's being able to bend reality, right? And whereas, say, a lesbian is someone you could define as a female that is attracted to the same sex, right? Okay, it's a woman that is in a intimate relationship or has those thoughts or feelings towards another female, right? It's very definable. But that's not where communism and Marxism thrives. It thrives in the indefinable, because that way they can then make truth malleable. They can seize control of truth, which in my opinion is the ultimate goal of a tyrannical regime, is to take
Yeah.
control of what is true. I want to pull up something here just to read really quickly. This is off of newdiscourses.com. And this is something that was published around this time last year, Negation of the Real, that you had done some pretty powerful speeches. But I want to highlight just this first paragraph of here, because I think that what this says here is an important foundation for understanding why the blurring of genders is so important in the long-term goals of a totalitarian system. And I want to toss it back to you. So it says here, if you want to impose a totalitarian system, you have a problem on your hands. Reality. The real is in your way and will eventually veto your project. Far sooner, people who can perceive reality will step in and prevent you from taking society over a cliff. Therefore, the only way to install a totalitarian system is to negate the real in the minds of those whom you would rule. This is accomplished by creating an interpretive frame that deliberately causes people to misunderstand reality, sometimes called a second reality or pseudo reality or even a hyper reality, which loses all contact with reality through its images and constructions. The totalitarian system works and would only work in that false image of reality. So this is part of your talks of sovereign nations. So this is a really important concept. And when I stumbled across that and doing some research ahead of the show, it was like, gosh, this is so important. And I think it's easy for us to get stuck in the surface battles, which are important, but hey, this book shouldn't be my child's school, or why is there a pride flag hanging up? There's no American flag. It's all important, but this is much more sinister. So how does this chart, I'll pull that up again. Folks, I have a quick message for you. Look, the 2024 election is do or die for the globalists and communists that have infiltrated our country and are currently running it. And they either have to win or they're going to destroy America so nothing is left either way. And if you're the person that's watching this show and following this information, unfortunately, you have the weight on your shoulders of making sure that your family is prepared, especially as we head into this next year and this next election cycle, because unfortunately, I think it's going to get rough. And one of the ways I know they're going to target us is through our food supply. You can see all the food factories burned down. You can see the warnings of coming famines and food shortages and everything like that. And food is one of the number one ways totalitarian regimes have always used to control the population, is destroy the food supply. So if you don't have at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of stored food, I highly recommend you take that very seriously, because look, as I mentioned, if you're the person that's watching this, you're the person that carries the burden of making sure your family is prepared. I would recommend at least 6 months, if not a year, of storable food. So if things go haywire, whether it's grid down or terrorist attack from what's coming across the border, that your family can safely stay in place and you can feed your family. So folks, today, go to heavensharvest.com and make sure you get your storable food that'll last for up to 25 years. Just in case things go south, you know that you have what's going to take to feed your family, which is so, so critical for us to get through this next stage of history. So go to heavensharvest.com today, order your food that'll last up to 25 years, and use promo code Seth to save 15% on your entire order. Again, that's heavensharvest.com and use promo code Seth, SETH, to save 15% on your entire order. How does this and the increase in the youth having this level of confusion over gender and their sexuality and all these trends, how does all of that fit into this destruction or this changing of reality, creating a hyper reality that can then be controlled and turned into a totalitarian system? So connect those up for us.
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about the chart first, because it was actually the question you asked the first time, and I kind of just unpacked a bunch of stuff. So is this driven was the question, or is this just happening? This is a chart indicating that it's driven. As a matter of fact, I just read recently that in all the big sexuality, the claim is that trans people have been around forever, right? There have always been trans people. We're just now discovering them because of these new inclusive policies. But when all the big sexologists, Kinsey, John Money, and so on, were desperately diving into these topics, looking into the idea of gender expression itself, very specifically, its relationship to sexuality, these people didn't find any transgender people. They found none, zero. It would have been to their benefit to have them. So there's not like they would have been covering it up. So this claim that, something that has basically arisen largely since the 1980s, kind of as a sideways turn out of kind of kink and transsexual culture and drag culture, this thing that's kind of arisen is not something that's always been happening and has been covered up by societal structures, or else these researchers who are very sympathetic to and were in fact actively searching for that kind of thing would have found evidence matching or at least paralleling numbers like what we see today. So this is absolutely ridiculous. What you see there, though, a lot of times gets chalked up to this concept called social contagion. And we know that there's such a thing as psychological social contagions. Psychological social contagions were kind of very first recognized for certain. I mean, they've happened throughout, this really has happened throughout history, whether it's, people believing that, some, omen in the sky, like a comet portends some bad thing and then they all get sick or whatever based on like the nocebo effect, or, various things have happened throughout history. This is certainly the case. But the first real that I know of psychological identification of a social contagion was the eating disorder called bulimia, which is a body dysmorphic disorder, just like trans is a body dysmorphic disorder, right? Okay, so bulimia virtually didn't exist, and if I have the names right, until Princess Diana came out as bulimic. There were something like 4 or 5 known cases. It was an extremely rare way for people to solve the problem of trying to be in extreme calorie deficit in order to deal with their fat-based body dysmorphia. Well, all of a sudden, this famous woman comes out. Maybe it was Di, maybe it wasn't. Comes out, and immediately there are like hundreds of thousands of cases of young women who are now doing the binge and purge routine. All of a sudden, they're in the 80s. Boom, thousands, if not millions, of girls have this disease bulimia that barely existed before that. Okay, so we know that happens, right? You can make it so that there is some pressure, psychological and social pressure, that's very powerful on young women. In particular, they seem to be more susceptible to it than young men for whatever reasons. Probably the challenges of female puberty, to be honest with you. And you can press this, which is an extremely toxic social environment for most young women. You can press this situation and cause kind of just a wildfire, again, emergent contagion. I don't think that that's adequate to explain these numbers for the trans phenomenon or the queer identities phenomenon like that was in that chart, and this rapid rise and this rapid generational rise. I think there's something more going on. In my studies, again, I harken back to Mao. My studies of how Mao utilized identity politics really shed some light on this for me. And so what Mao's identity politics did was he created good categories of people and bad categories of people. He labeled them red and black. And everybody had to put their class identity on virtually everything. Your class identity was meant to be visible all the time. Now, I'm not going to get into the full details of how his worked, but the idea was that you had 2 kinds of good identities, what I call tokens and revolutionaries. The tokens were the laborers and the peasants with their hammers and their sickles. The communists don't really care about those people, just like they don't really care about gay people, just like they don't really care about black people, just like they don't really care about immigrants. They don't care about these people. They care about the utility of their political status to achieve power. And so the other group of good people are the revolutionaries. Well, if you're one of the bad categories, you can't become a peasant. You're always stained by your class identity because it's believed to be mental and spiritual. So it doesn't matter. You can go have the most peasanty, awful peasant existence in China, but if your grandfather was a landlord, you're still a landlord, right? So there's no getting out of it. So you can't become a token. You get sent to gulag to learn or labor camp actually, to learn the value of hard work to the system, to let you simulate that as a form of thought reform. But you really can't become one of the token class. You can, however, become a revolutionary. So you're relentlessly pressured about being in the wrong class identity. You're a second class citizen. You have different legal structures around you, maybe little or none. You can't get good money. You can't get enough food. You can't get good clothing. Your shelter is insecure. You have all these problems if you're in the so-called black classes. And you have fewer of those problems if you're in the so-called red classes, which Mao labeled, by the way, the people and the enemies of the people. So the enemies of the people have a huge pressure to become people, but the only path open to them to become people is to become a revolutionary. So they have to join the Revolutionary Army. They have to join a revolutionary cadre. They have to go through brainwashing to learn how to be a good communist, to wash their brains red. And here we have the exact same situation in the United States. We have characters like racists and sexists and homophobes and transphobes, all these undesirables, these deplorable identities. And there's a massive amount of social pressure. You're on the wrong side of history. You're this, you're that. You could lose your job if you say the wrong thing. You could, tons of social pressure. If you're a little kid, you just get treated different. You're boring. You're awful. Your ancestors caused all these problems. We know how kids are mean to each other and they bully each other. And we know how this works, and they know how this works. And then you say, well, you can't change your skin color. You can't change your sex. But here's all these queer identities that are extraordinarily radical and disruptive to you, to your family, to your faith, to your community. And you can join those. In other words, here are a bunch of revolutionary identities you can dump into. So I don't believe that a social contagion is adequate to explain the rocket ride of numbers we see, where the chart, I think, went up to Gen Z, with identification with queer identities. And in particular, it says LGBTQ, but we don't know what that actually means. It's not actually clear at all. They aggregate and disaggregate data according to whatever benefits them the most. And then other people that are doing polls just don't know what they're dealing with here, to get fine-grained about it, to find out if we're dealing with queer activists or actual gay people, which are not the same thing at all. So what we end up finding out then is that I think that there's this incredible manufactured social pressure on top of the regular social contagion effect, because that's who the cool kids are. They've made it be who the cool kids are. And that's where you come into the second part of your question. That's where the construction of hyper reality is. In reality, men are men, women are women. It's not actually possible. It doesn't matter how many surgeries. It doesn't matter how many hormones. It doesn't matter how many chemicals. It doesn't matter how much you change the external form of the body. You actually cannot change a man into a woman. At the end of the day, I mean, chromosomes are a sex determining mechanism. They are not sex itself. And this is a whole biological thing we don't have to get into. But the fact of the matter is that if we were to do all the most perfect surgeries and hormone treatment on whatever, let's say it's Caitlyn Jenner, for what lack of a better person, and we were transform them into every semblance of a woman that you could possibly imagine, down to a womb transplant, the whole thing. Maybe the surgeries are 10 years or 20 years or 100 years down the line and they actually work. The fact of the matter is, if we pulled Jenner's blood, you're still going to find XY. You can't change every single cell. And if you were to change every single cell of the DNA to sound very much like Sam Harris, you've changed the person. You don't have the same person there anymore. You have a completely different person. Every person has a unique fingerprint, unique irises, unique retinas, unique gait, apparently, according to the Chinese Communist Party's analysis tools. They have unique everything, but they actually have completely, perfectly, unless they're identical twins, unique DNA. And they have this perfectly unique DNA down to themselves. And if you change that DNA, they're not the same thing anymore. They're literally a different person. So the only way you could possibly do that is if you figured out some super like Star Trek technology to swap out every piece of DNA for another piece of DNA. You've taken a person who lived to be however long and you've erased that person and replaced it with a different person. So it still doesn't work. So the idea that men can become women, or that gender is this, so the idea that men can become women is false. Okay. It's just false. It's not part of reality. But this is fundamental to this queer analysis of sex and gender. Now, on the other hand, gender is made up. It is the thing that is imposed upon reality as a hyper-real construct. Can you change gender? Yeah, why the hell not? Because it doesn't exist. You can change your gender all you want, because gender doesn't actually mean anything. It primarily refers to what we might call tertiary sex characteristics as they interlace with personality. They have almost nothing to do with secondary sex characteristics, and they have absolutely nothing to do with primary sex characteristics. Gender was introduced primarily by John Money, but preceding him, Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson, introduced the idea of gender identity. And then John Money, the sexologist and zoologist, as it turns out, and psychiatrist. No, he wasn't a zoologist. That was Kinsey. Sorry. He was a sexologist and psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. John Money came up with this idea that, well, there's all these people with disorders of sexual development, DSD, which we used to call intersex, which we used to call before that, and John Money calls hermaphroditism. So they're hermaphrodites. They have maybe their chromosomes are mixed up. It happens to about 1 in 5,000 births. There are 18 different syndromes in which your chromosomes can be not XY or XX. Okay, so what? That happens. Or maybe that they have some hormonal influence and their genitals don't form quite right or whatever, and they have ambiguous genitalia, they're of ambiguous sex on first examination. As it turns out, every one of these people can be categorized in one sex or the other. It can be very difficult, but they're a very small portion of the population. And John Money said, well, they exist. And this is the same argument the trans people give to this day. They exist. Therefore, whatever it is, how they decide to live their life as a male or female, that's a gender identity, must not be rooted in sex. Therefore, it must be this free-floating concept that you can do whatever you want with. So gender becomes the tool of hyper-reality. Gender doesn't really exist. Gender is defined as one's internal sense of being male or female, as a matter of fact, which they've then said, well, why does it have to be limited to male or female? Which, of course, later on is like, why does it have to be restricted to being human at all? Maybe we can all be like some cyborgs, or we can upload our consciousness and be disembodied, or maybe we can be animals, or I don't know what in the world they're going to come up with next. But whatever it is, you can't say they're wrong, because that would be bigotry. This imposes this image of hyper reality. And then when it's hard to get adults to live in the matrix, it's not hard to get kids to grow up believing in fantasies. In fact, it's like a cultural thing that we encourage our kids to believe in things like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and these kind of magical characters. And then at some point in their I guess somewhere in the preteen range, usually, we disabuse them as they enter, as they would say medically, probably around Tanner stage 2, we start to disabuse them of their fantasies. Well, Tanner stage 2 happens to be exactly when the transgender people want to interrupt puberty with puberty blockers, because rather than disabusing them of this gender fantasy that they've been fed and sexuality fantasy that they've been said, setting aside that never should even, why are we even talking to children about this except to destroy them? It shouldn't be happening. But setting that aside, it's then at the moment when they would start to be growing into enough of an adult sense of abstraction to be able to see through these problems and to ask the right questions that penetrate the Santa Claus myth, they're trying to interrupt that vigorously, both psychologically and, well, not both, psychologically, socially, and finally, even chemically and surgically. So I was going to say both socially and medically, but these are egregious violations of what it means to be human, and these are crimes against humanity. And I think that this is the greatest child abuse scandal that's maybe ever been committed. Trying to think of like historical examples, and I'm like, well, the Incas, right? Like march them to the top of a volcano and cut their heart out and throw their body down or whatever. Like that's like on par with what we're doing here. And like, I can't think of any other examples that rival this. So anyways, they create a hyper reality or a pseudo reality or a second reality in which gender is primary and sex is actually maybe secondary and maybe not even really all that relevant to who you are. Your gender identity. I actually just read from a lawsuit, and I can't give any details about that, a line where one of the expert witnesses for the woke side of this lawsuit argued explicitly that for a court of law, argued explicitly that sex is determined by one's gender identity, which is literally an inversion of reality. So you can see that this is, again, I said, you hear all this stuff as an adult and you think, my gosh, that's confusing. And again, remember the idea now that you're raising a 6-year-old 30, 40 hours a week in this milieu, and what confusion and fantastical beliefs they will accept, which is again why they target children so vigorously. And I'm sorry I've given such a long answer, but these things really deserve to be unpacked.
No, they
in full
do.
depth.
They do. Well, it's like my 3-year-old, she believes that T-Rexes live in the woods behind our house. And I'm okay with that, right? At a certain point, we'll have the conversation. She'll understand that T-Rexes don't actually live in the woods behind our house, but it makes for interesting story times and games outside.
I saw a joke about that on the internet the other day. It's kind of funny. It says, Christian dads or whatever. And it says, it shows the dad talking to the daughter, and his daughter says, I think there's a monster in my closet. And the dad's like, no, honey, it's a demon.
Yeah, there you go. So there's a lot of questions I have, but I want to make sure that I'm understanding some of the key concepts that you're discussing because it's helpful for me. So, looking back into some of the roots of communism and class warfare, right? You mentioned Mao specifically and creating the red class and the black class, right? The black class
Hmm.
becomes outcast, et cetera. But the black class also tries to, what you said, they can join the revolutionary, they can become a revolutionary, which is their gateway into the red class, which is the protected class. So when I see, obviously, within this particular version of class warfare, which is the LGBTQ plus versus the straight racist and sexist and whatever words they're going to use, which is the black class that they've created. That you see that, okay, so obviously the kids that feel confused, they're identifying as this, they instantly get grandfathered in, or they're placed into the most protected version of the red class, right? They're idolized in our society as being the brave, and they have a whole month to celebrate their braveness. But then what you also have, what I'm seeing, is the virtue signaling, which, from what you said, what I've now understood with this is what the virtue signaling is it's still class warfare, because what's doing is it's taking, say, the straight 35-year-old liberal soccer mom, right? Who's obviously, she has kids, she has a husband, she's not part of that. But because of her fear of being classified as the black class, she has to publicly state her support of the red class. Which is why, I'll go onto Facebook and I'll see, friends of mine that I know, they're married with kids. They're so outward with their support of Pride Month. It's like but now I understand it differently through what you've said, though, is that what they're doing is they're buying their acceptance into the red class. They're publicly
Hmm.
stating, I'm not part of the black class, I'm part of the red class,
Hmm.
which is, so what it's doing, though, is it's extending this class warfare beyond just the people that actually identify as LGBTQ, which they have all kinds of programs to rapidly increase that. Like, this is one graph I found while talking, while listening to you, instances of LGBTQ representation in video games. And this is only up from 86 to 2017. It's like, I wonder if that has anything to do with what kids are thinking, right? You look at the same thing in Disney, et cetera. You can see that this absolutely part of a larger social engineering process. But so that was interesting, that the realization that the virtue signaling is a way of grouping yourself with the accepted and the protected class in terms of the social narrative. But then what's also interesting that I pulled from what you said, and I want you to expand on this a little bit, is that it not only creates these greater separation between the red class and the black class, but I feel like that when you look at the Pride Month activities, you look at the painting of the streets, you look at the White House with the rainbow flags, and you look at everything that they're doing, it what I'm also gathering is that that's also part of the social engineering and part of the disruption, because what they're trying to do is elicit a hatred from within the black class. They're taking the
Hmm.
regular guy who, say, he's 40-year-old guy with a couple of kids and doesn't really care. He wants to raise his kids right, Christian dad, whatever. And he's not really that bothered by the gay stuff, because it's like, okay, let them do what they're going to do, and I'm going to raise my kids how I'm going to raise them. But by shoving it down his throat so much, through the school, through the local shopping district, which has pride flags everywhere, etc., it's creating a negative response in that person to want to fight it, right? So that's also part of it. So is that what
That's right.
you're seeing? Are those pretty accurate assessments?
Yeah, these people are system dynamic thinkers, and so they're constantly looking for a way to create a system from which they can extract power and opportunity and maybe money. And so in this case, you're absolutely right. There's actually a principle. It was first articulated by Saul Alinsky. It's repeated in the updated activist manual everybody should go read, which is called Beautiful Trouble. It's online at beautifultrouble.org. That's one of their activist training platforms, and they have a principle you can see on the screen. There's principles is one of the things that is called your enemies, or your targets, I should say. Alinsky labeled it enemies. Your target's reaction is your real action. That is actually one of their principles. So they're trying to provoke that response. They're trying to get that reactionary fervor, so then they can create this dynamic in which what they're going to say is, look at all the anti-LGBTQ hate we have in our country now. This has always been there. It's been hidden. People were trying to play nice, but now it's risen up, and now it's a big deal. And so they are trying to provoke that reaction from which they will extract an excuse or a narrative that furthers their own agendas. And they're very, very, very good at this. And it's very easy to step into the trap. Now, as far as the identity politics, I want to nuance what you showed a little bit because it's a little bit more delicate and evil than that. You are absolutely right. You took it correctly from me that so once you create this dynamic between the people and the enemies of the people, red and the black classes, what you have is people that are within the black class and people who are within the red classes vigorously virtue signaling that they belong in the red classes. There are horrible stories of what people who were designated red class identity in China did to keep their red identity, turning in neighbors, sacrificing their own children, even in some cases, to demonstrate their commitment to Mao and his agendas. So everybody virtue signals. This creates this illusion, like you said, the White House, like the government, they're painting it on the streets of we include you, we include you, we include you. The enemies don't include you, right? So the red class includes the token identities, but the black classes hate them. And they create that reaction to fuel that narrative, which creates a stronger pressure pump to drive people toward the red class and to say that the black class is actually really awful. And so then, though, it's a little bit nastier than this because, again, the token versus revolutionaries distinction is equally important. And that one's not usually laid out clearly in the literature. I think this is my own contribution to understanding this dynamic. The LGB are tokens. Like I said, they're the human shields of this project. So when you identify through this pressure, let's say that there's some kid, he's in a Christian family, he's white boy or white girl or whatever. So now you have this white Christian and black class. There we go. We already know black class, right? So the pressure gets on, and this kid starts to say, well, maybe I can get this pressure off of me, probably in their subconscious, thinking that maybe I'm actually gay or whatever. I'm seeing all this stuff. And what they actually see is that if I identify this way, I get treated way better. The president's on my side. There's parades for me. Everything's colors and rainbows. I don't know if you know, all the colorful rainbow flags for all the different sexualities, but the one for straight is gray. It's three gray stripes and three different tones of gray. And so, you're having the kids color which flag might be you. And then who's going to pick the gray one, right? And so there's all this pressure and they see, well, if I go there, I'll be fine. But if they go over and say, hey, I'm gay, at first they get accepted, but all they've done is ask for admittance into the tokens, not the revolutionaries. And that exact same pressure is there. Let me tell you about a concept that you might not have heard of. You've heard of heteronormativity, which is that it's normal for people to be heterosexual in a sexually dimorphic society with sexual reproduction. Okay, fine. And it's normative also. So there's a social pressure that you should probably try to, act in a way consistent with your heterosexuality. Okay, so fine. There's another concept called homonormativity, and it is not what it sounds like. You can't take the definition of heteronormative and then just slide over and say, oh, so it means gay people are normal and they're the default for society. That's not what it means. What it means is that gay people are considered normal within society. They're a normal variation of human sexuality, and therefore there will be no discrimination against them. In other words, equality. Actually, gay equality and acceptance are homonormative. That's why a lot of these people are criticized for passing or trying to actually like Pete Buttigieg. We know is gay. We know his father translated the prison notebooks from Antonio Gramsci and started the Cultural Revolution, the cultural Marxist floodgates in the 1970s in the United States. But we also know that he was criticized while he was running for president. If you remember way back when he ran in the Democratic slate for president, he was criticized for wearing a suit and a tie and presenting himself as though he's just any other guy. So he wasn't showing up in some flamboyant manner to run for president. And they criticized him, writing articles so much as he may sleep with men or be married to a man, but he's not actually gay because he doesn't espouse the radical politics. So the same pressure that's on normal people to become allies, which are virtue signalers in support of the red classes, or to become activists, which is a revolutionary version of that, the same pressure that's put on them is put also on the tokens. It's not enough for you to be gay. You need to be actively queer. You need to be an activist on our behalf. So that pressure's there. This is how exquisitely evil this whole program is. So there's this is social engineering is the only possible word that you could use to describe something this intentionally malevolent that's meant to drive people into activist positions even though those activist positions are likely to, in the short to long run, ruin their lives.
At the very heart of our democracy lies a principle we hold sacred: free speech. It's the cornerstone that supports every freedom we cherish. Yet, in today's digital age, discussions about our wealth, our rights, and our future are being silenced or overshadowed in mainstream narratives, leaving many feeling voiceless in conversations crucial to our financial independence and security. This is where wealth protection research steps in, armed with a mission that's never been more critical. Wealth protection research is not a financial advisory firm. They're defenders of free speech committed to giving a voice to the silenced. Wealth protection research tirelessly seeks out financial experts. These are the voices that challenge prevailing narratives, especially as we navigate the uncertainties of the 2024 election. Wealth protection research has created a 2024 election wealth protection report. This free report highlights the three best ideas for protecting and growing your money heading into the 2024 election. It contains ideas the mainstream media won't even touch, and listeners can get it completely free. So text ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy. If you believe in the sanctity of free speech and the importance of financial freedom, then act now. So text ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy of this 2024 election protection report. It's time to widen the scope of what we're told, to hear the ideas the establishment does not think you can handle, and to take control of our financial destinies. So folks, today, text ideas to 76626 to claim your free copy. So, okay, there's a lot going on here. One thing I wanted to just pull up, just because I was looking, I started searching for homonormativity, and then autofill for homonormativity meme. And this is the first time I've seen this, right? Google has a warning here saying memes about people, memes about groups of people might be disturbing or hurtful. I've never had Google give me a warning, but I'm curious, or just curious, what happens if I say like Republican meme, right? I'm curious if Google also gives us the warning that we shouldn't have hurtful memes. I mean, and that's just an obvious point. But so when we take a step back from this, right? And you mentioned the social engineers, is a concept that I really enjoy digging into. You know, studying Bernays and Gustav Le Bon, and looking at the people that have understood how to engineer society, and really, because I think it's helpful to understand where we're at as a society right now, and looking at the controlling mechanisms behind it. The bigger picture of this, right? Because it's one thing to say that, okay, we can recognize that this agenda is a social, it's driven by social engineering, and they're brilliant social engineers. Like they understand human psychology better than almost anybody does. Like it's insane how well they understand these little triggers. Same thing with the pandemic, to understand that you're not going to do something of your own volition, but if it's because you're acting because you want to protect your grandma, that's a whole new depth of social engineering and getting people to comply with something. So, from the 100,000-foot view, what is the end goal of this? Because you look back at China and you can see that, okay, the end goal of the social engineering from Mao and his orchestrators, his social engineers that worked with him, was communist revolution. It was the overthrow of the traditional system. It was the overthrow, and it was the implication of a complete totalitarian system that ended up taking tens of millions of lives, and it is still continuing to wreak havoc in the world. If you look at what's happening in modern day China, the Uyghurs, the Falun Gong organ harvesting, like it's still there, alive and well. So looking at that, drawing from that, and looking at America and seeing that we're now experiencing the 2.0 version of that, which is the modern version of the social engineering that's creating class warfare, et cetera. Two questions for you, and these might not be easy ones to answer. Who do you see as the main driver? What entity do you see as driving and controlling this social engineering and this class warfare? And question two is, what is the end goal of that?
I mean, that's actually like the question, right? And so we'll just put out the caveat at the beginning. Nobody knows specifically who. Now, if you were to ask me, what's your elevator pitch for who's causing the problem, I would say it's the United Nations in conjunction with the Chinese Communist Party. That's it. The UN and the CCP. Virtually everything happening in education is downstream from UNESCO. Everything happening, like kind of in children's cultural stuff, is downstream from UNESCO. The United Nations has been quite explicit, at least for 2 decades, about a little over 2 decades, 25 years, a quarter century, for their agenda to become, in a sense, what they have described in their own words as a global nervous system. So, the nervous system of a single global organism of humanity in the biosphere, which they, of course, as a central nervous system, will coordinate. And so, UNESCO is kind of at the bottom of a lot of this. Comprehensive sexuality education was invented at UNESCO, but supporting that, of course, is the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum basically takes the UN agenda and drives it practically into the business and political sphere and into what they call the public-private partnership sphere, where the public sector and private sector become a single hyphenated sector, public-private sector. And this is the model is based off of China, and China's very savvy at this political warfare game. The CCP, I should say, is very savvy at this political warfare game and has been feeding these narratives in. Now, the kind of weird twist is, of course, there's lots of names we could name, but there's one name that hangs over kind of all of these weird things, which is George Soros. As it turns out, George Soros's method, his dialectic, a lot of people don't know that word, but Marx called his program dialectical materialism. Dialectical could really be, it's more specific than this, but a good quasi synonym, half synonym for it would be transformational. So, transformational materialism, you're going to transform the nature of the material reality to be something different. That was dialectical materialism for Marx. Well, Soros explicitly outlines his own form of what he calls, in his words, social alchemy, using what he calls his shoelace dialectic called reflexivity. This is outlined in the book Alchemy of Finance, which is Soros's magnum opus, written and published, I should say, in 1992. And in that book, he actually explains that the CCP was extremely interested in the late 80s in reflexivity. And he spent a lot of time in China before he became one of their mortal enemies. And it turns out that the CCP took the reflexive method in order to advance past where they were stuck with Marx's dialectical materialism. It allows you effectively to do propaganda-based or political warfare-based approaches that move the needle of socialism out of the economic sphere, but into the kind of economic, cultural, social sphere as a blended entity, but mostly the social and cultural spheres. And so Soros is behind an enormous amount of this, ironically enough, with slightly different ambitions or reasons, at least. Same endpoint, really. That's complicated. Maybe I don't know if we should get into that. Soros wants an open society. The CCP wants a closed society, but otherwise it's the same. That's the short version of it. So at any rate, what you have is these huge players are trying to manipulate society, create that hyper reality we talked about previously, to create the image that society is going a particular way so that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the reflexive method. Is the kind of quintessential example is a bank run. You tell people the bank is going to fail, so a bunch of people run out, take all their money out, and the bank fails. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy due to lots of people acting on false information. That's the definition of reflexivity. It's got to be based on, as Soros says, the distance between reality and narrative, or reality and belief. And so that's a huge dishonest, mark against the program. But it does actually work when people don't understand that it's being done to them. So he's also a huge player in this, but in his own kind of weird way. What is the objective? Well, we already said the objective is to transform society. And transforming society also primarily means placing most of the money and most of the power in very few hands. That's the real project of communism, is to put most of the money and most of the power in very few hands, who are now they have a deeper spiritual ambition, which is to shepherd humanity to become the new man. And the new man will be able to do the correct praxis that will transform society into the new society, which is us. And kind of to riff from Marx, but not to quote him, it would be us re-entering the Garden of Eden on our own terms. Which a Marxist in the 60s, I guess he wrote it in the 50s, Herbert Marcuse, the most influential of the Western Marxists, wrote in Eros and Civilization that we kind of know the way to the ideal society, which is to take a second bite from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, or of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's this idea that by awakening ourselves to their the true nature of humanity, which is allegedly socialist, we can enter into our own Garden of Eden on our own terms without the, awful demiurge demon god controlling us and keeping us in ignorance as slaves, but also out of the toil and suffering of the world. Which for the Christians watching, you'll recognize that, oh crap, it's the Gnostic heresies from the first century all over again.
Which really goes back, I think it was The Fiddler by Marx. With Satan, I have struck my deal.
That's right.
It goes straight back to this battle of good and evil. So,
Hmm.
one final question to close out this discussion, and then I want to talk about your upcoming documentary movie,
Yeah.
Beneath Sheep's Clothing. So, you mentioned before that Pride Month this year is a lot less of fanfare as it was before. Like they overplayed their hand, they overdid it. So, going back into, especially looking at Eastern philosophy, the yin and the yang, they have the balance, right? That when something reaches an extreme, it actually pulls back, right? And that's what keeps things in balance. The law of opposites, et cetera, however you want to look at it. So when you look at where we are right now, they've pushed this agenda in hopes of doing something to our society and achieving some end goal. But do you think that this overall agenda, this push for social engineering, will it fall? Do you see it following that trend line where maybe in 10 years, 2/3 of all young people are now LGBTQ, or do you think that we're actually seeing a point where it's peaked, and now we're seeing this pushback that their agenda is starting to collapse as more people are rejecting it?
Yeah, so I think it has peaked. I think actually we're seeing a major split between young men and young women. Young men are not having this anymore. Young women are still increasingly having it. So we have this greater divide yet again between important populations of people. You know, young people entering the beginning of their marriage and childbearing ages are going to be very much at odds. I talked to a guy recently who was pretty convincing to me that he finds all this to be very optimistic because if the boys are getting their heads on straight, the girls will eventually follow. It won't go the other way. And so he's pretty optimistic. I think it's peaked, but what I want to point out, two things I want to point out. One is that the way that this works is through what sympathies can be generated with the public. Okay, so previously we could have sympathy generated particularly for the young person who was disowned by their parents because of their sexuality or something about them, right? And this was a kind of a heart-wrenching story. I think a lot of people who are, in their 30s and 40s were raised on this story as this boogeyman of the angry Christian conservative dad who's going to no gay son of mine or whatever and kick him out of the house. And so they virtue signal their inclusion to show that they're not this evil character from their past that traumatized them psychologically, because we have this reservoir of public sympathy. And what's happened is with the overplaying of the hand is actually draining the reservoir of public sympathy. The goodwill of the people is no longer with Pride. Even if you were kind of against it, you were like, well, at least it's people like advocating for themselves and getting out and having energy. And it was like a day, and then it was a week, and now it's like a freaking month. And it's like it started to be too much of an ask. So the sympathies aren't there. Another example, not to really get into the details of it, is these activists that are blocking traffic to make a point or throwing paint or soup on monuments or whatever. We had one today in the news that somebody sprayed down Stonehenge, and everybody says this doesn't help their cause. Well, it gets them a lot of attention, which is part of helping their cause in a different way. But no, people, you can see the reservoir of public sympathy. This is not the best example, but it's one that comes to mind. You remember that story where the activists blocked traffic on a highway in Panama, and this retired lawyer gets out, tells them to move. They don't move, so he shoots two of them. And did the world say, "Oh my God, a murderer"?
No,
No,
he
the
was a
world was
hero.
like, they were like FAFO, right? Like we've had enough. So the public sympathy arc is gone. But that's actually, it turns out, I thought it was a bad example. It's a really good example, because the other thing I want to say is that the powers that be, the evil, does not care how it consolidates power and money to itself in very few hands. So what will happen is, you mentioned the yin and the yang, as it goes up and it comes back down, the feminine energy, let's call it that. Why not? The yin has maximized and it's hit its zenith. And then the seed of its, destruction, the little white dot in the taijutsu shows up, and now it's going to wane. And what's going to happen is yang, this angry masculine energy, is going to arise and smash all of these idols and bash things and take. you can damn well bet that that desire for catharsis is going to get exploited by these demons who want power. And so when they can't get it, just to put it in different terms that I think are stark for people, if they can't get the power they want out of the left, they're going to get it out of the right. And that's historically the rise of every fascist movement you ever saw, which happened to be funded by the same people who funded the communists, which means there's some game being played by the ultra elite, ultra powerful, cough, cough, royal families, cough, cough, of Europe that is trying to push this dynamic not toward a free society or the cause of liberty, which they hate, and a thriving middle class, which they resent and loathe, but rather instead to tidal waves of communism and fascism fighting back and forth as reaction and counter reaction back and forth to drive society into the breaking point. And I think that what we have to be very cautious of now is this desire for catharsis is high. When I see that guy shoot two people and we're like, hell yeah, about time, that's not a human response. That is a cathartic response. I'm frustrated that these people are acting this way. I'm frustrated that they're in the road. So yeah, hit them with your car. That's going to get clipped out of context. But you know what I'm saying? That desire is actually a gigantic liability. We have no idea our danger that when this woke movement, when the entities pushing it as hard as they are pushing it, realize that it has peaked, that public sympathy is tipped the other way, and that frustration, they're dragging it out to raise the frustration, because the more frustration, the more need for catharsis. And when that catharsis comes, it's going to be like a dam breaking. Everybody knows that. And the water is going to flow vigorously. And these guys are going to be like with giant pumps making the water flow even faster, because they want this thing to be the worst possible flood. It doesn't matter if it comes from left or right. All they need to do is destroy things like the Constitution. They need to destroy the Charter of Rights in Canada. They need to destroy these things that secure our liberties so that they can take power. And if it's the opposite ideology for 7 years or 6 years or whatever it is, so that they can get the power, then they can switch it back to whatever they actually want. What's 6 or 7 years? Who cares? And so once they have the consolidated power, they could, for example, let's just put it in stark other terms, Nazis and commies. The commies could have a plan to let the Nazis run everything, destroy all of the institutions. And then once they have enough power, all they're going to do is purge all the Nazis. They have no problem purging everybody that they've already used in the past. All these poor queer theory kids, damaged goods, they're not useful. They're destabilizers. Mao got rid of them after the destabilization phases, and every wave of his activity from the 1940s all the way through till 1976 when he died. So you can expect, it doesn't matter. My point is that it doesn't matter how they get power. So they're going to capitalize on this desire for catharsis to push people over the edge so that they can justify whether it's a, martial law reaction, whether it's a completely delegitimize one political side, or, whatever it is, or just take power from the right wing. It doesn't really matter. That will be the next agenda. So people have to figure out how to channel their desire for when you have this catharsis, it's the desire to see your enemies punished. But what you actually really, really want isn't to see your enemies punished. You might want that, but what you really want is things to go back to normal, and for there to be conditions that secure the fact that things aren't going to go off the rails again. So you have to channel that energy into the right thing, as they would say in the Marxist literature, going against that because they want revolutionary spirit. They want you to be this way. What you have to do is sublimate that desire for catharsis to a higher level of understanding. And that sublimated understanding is that we're using this to regain the good society and preserve it.
Which is a really, really important point. It's this, we could have a whole show just on this, is just the importance of staying calm. Because whether it's, say, you mentioned the guy that I remember seeing that, in South America, he shot the protester and all the cheering. Well, imagine what happens if a public figure that the right absolutely despises is assassinated, right? I know you've probably seen there's a video, you keep seeing it pop up again, of the guy that throws a pie in Bill Gates' face, right? He has a cream pie, he's hiding behind a pillar and gets him. Like if that happened on a larger scale, that could tip off like really, really, really bad things. So I think that as much as I'd say a lot of people that are more, on the right, or, however you want to categorize that, see what's happening to our country and they hate it and they're frustrated. They know communism is around the corner. We have to be so careful because we could so easily play into their hand. Because whenever, and this is how I try to live my life, it's like whenever we're emotionally off base, we can be manipulated and become a tool of the devil. It doesn't matter whether
That's
it's
right.
a good emotion or a bad emotion or it's excitement or it's fear. All those things take us away from our center and they can lead to destruction. So that's an important lesson.
That's why the kids are saying that what you try to strive to be is based, real, and stoic. So you're based in your principles, you're real, you're not living in hyper reality, and you're stoic. You're not having your emotions thrown around all over the place. But that also includes your desire for revenge or
Yeah.
catharsis or whatever else. You've got to tame that passion as well. If we read back to the ancient Greeks, the passion you have to choose, is your rational mind or your passionate mind dominating? In other words, in Christian language, is logos or pathos the one that's dominating your, I guess that's Greek language too, but this was very clear. John is about Christianity being a religion of logos, which means it's an exclusion of pathos. And if just as a kind of interesting kind of sidebar, I read Alexander Dugin's essay, Fascism, Borderless and Red. And he actually says in there that the fascism is, in fact, an expression of the pathos, this desire for reaction against the provocations of communism and the degeneracy that it comes with it is a eruption of pathos. Well, if we are going to be a people with a flourishing society, we need to be people of logos, which means we've got to be based, real, and stoic.
There's a good meme. As we finish up, tell us about Beneath Sheep's Clothing. I know I've had Julie Belling on before, who's brilliant. You're involved with this. This is a documentary, important documentary coming out mid-July. What do we need to know about this?
Yeah, so I had the privilege. I just now went to Detroit for Charlie Kirk's Turning Point Action People's Conference. That was 8,000 some odd, 9,000 some odd people showed up in Detroit, Michigan, as they were saying, at the scene of the crime, where the actual vote tallies in Michigan went weird in the 2020 election, in that building. Also around the corner, the building where Ronald Reagan was nominated for president. So it turns out it's a very interesting historical building right there in downtown Detroit on the water. And I was there and I had this weird experience where people were coming up to me. This thing has only been screened a couple of times for a couple of audiences, but luckily it was a Turning Point adjacent audiences. So all these people end up coming up to me at this conference and they're like, "You're the Beneath Sheep's Clothing guy." And I'm like, of all the things I can be recognized for, being recognized for something that's not out yet is kind of neat. But so there's buzz about this thing happening, and everybody was like, "It's the best movie I've ever seen about these subjects yet. It tells more of the story. It makes it so clear. I'm going to make everybody I know watch it, or get everybody I know to watch it. We're going to show it at our church." The enthusiasm, and I mean, if it was one person, I would have been like, "Yeah, that's cool." It was like six. I'm like, what? There weren't that many people at the showing. I wasn't even at the showing. It turns out I was in Europe at the time and missed it. That's when I went to yell at the United Nations in Geneva itself with a rally there. So the movie, since other people say it, I'll say that. I mean, I'm featured rather prominently in the film, but the film is meant to convey the idea that communism, it's not that it's coming, it's already here. And here's how it works in churches, and here's how that worked in the Soviet Union by comparison, and here's how that might work in China by comparison, and here's what the agenda is with a global religion that turns out to be some watered down, goofy version of communism that they call sustainability and inclusion. Its still a goal is to make the sustainable and inclusive man, the new man who's going to usher in the new sustainable and inclusive society that's like a kind of a utopia at a global scale. It's the exact same ambition. It's just kind of got new branding. It's a new wrapper on the same old turd. And so it does that, but then it does it with the schools in particular, with a very deep dive in terms of how critical pedagogy, as it's called, where it developed and why it is Maoist brainwashing that's used to bring these global citizenship, sustainable inclusion, DEI values as a value system, as a religious, as a kind of a state, global state religion set of values to the kids. So what you get then, like we were talking about earlier about how with Mao he had this overthrow, which is correct. In 1949, his civil war succeeded. He overthrew China. In this case, what you almost have is an underthrow. of society. What's happening is all the young people and their are for now generations filtering up into the institutions are underthrowing our society to a different value system. It's not this, kind of military overthrow. It's this kind of grassroots feeling. Most of it's astroturfed, feeling like it's bubbling up from the bottom, transformation of society. And if you hear what these devils say, they say things like that, well, the youth are the ones who are going to take us where we need to go. The youth have the right values. The youth are already changing. But they also say very explicitly that their goal is to get the youth to put the pressure on the rest of society. I mean, they openly say that. They say that the youth are being brought up in these values and will demand them. They will demand them from their customers. They will demand them from their employers. They'll demand them from their supply chains. And so it's like this weird underthrow of society. And I think that the movie Beneath Sheep's Clothing does a better job of articulating the big picture of what's happening with enough detail to connect to people, to really get that message out and really hopefully impact a lot of folks.
Which is such an important message. So the website beneathsheepsclothing.movie comes out mid-July. You can pre-order it on the website. You can donate, watch a trailer, merch, etc. I'll make sure that is in the description below. Also, what I'll do is, as soon as we finish the interview, I'm just going to play the trailer of it. So I'll make sure that once the interview concludes, it's going to kick right into the trailer so people can watch the trailer. It's such an important message. And I'm going to just read this really quickly. It's really important. This is on the webpage. It says, "This is not fiction. This is a wake-up call to the American people, to everyone with children in schools, to Christians, and to anyone who cares about freedom." So, important film. James Lindsay, it's been fantastic speaking with you. I feel like we could do 10 more shows on 10 different topics and still not run out of source material. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for being an important voice out there. And I look forward to having you on again. So take care, man. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Thank you. I'll just say,
Yes.
Since you're about to show the trailer, I think what you're going to notice is that the trailer is pretty action-packed. It's not this kind of boring talking head documentary. Of course, there's lots of talking heads, but there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of excitement in this film. We really tried to ratchet up how engaging and interesting and exciting it is. Well, I say we, the filmmaker and the producers did. I'm just the talent. But we tried to get it to really have that vibe. So what you see in the trailer is indicative of what you're going to see in the film. It's action-packed, it's fast-moving, there's a lot there, and it's really eye-opening. So I hope, it resonates. And if we get the chance to talk again anytime, let me know. It'd be great. It's a great conversation.
Absolutely. All right, well, thank you, and let's go ahead and roll the trailer.
Here's the thing about communism. When it comes knocking at your door, it doesn't say, "Hi, I'm here to impoverish, enslave, and murder you." It says, "I'm here to liberate you from oppression."
I thought of myself as a happy kid. I had no idea that I was being brainwashed.
So the KGB agents would go into the church and then rise up.
That's right. All of them is infiltrated.
This was a rape of the body of Christ.
You take over the colleges of education, then you take over all the teachers, then you take over all the students, and thus you get the future.
He said the ultimate objective of having government school was to destroy Christianity. Those were his words.
People's war means to destroy the opposing country through unconventional methods.
And Khrushchev bragged about it. We'll take America without firing a shot.
In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of American students without being challenged. The result you can see.
There are ravening wolves in sheep's clothing all over the place.
Folks, I hope you enjoyed that interview. I've actually got something really exciting for you. So I'm a big fan of art, and I'm a big fan of people that stand up against the man, against the deep state, the cabal, whatever you want to call them. And as you probably know, the entire movie and entertainment industry has been completely hijacked by a communist, you could even say satanic agenda. And so it's been very difficult to get non-communist and satanic information, especially movies and music, etc., that are actually promoting good traditional values into the mainstream. You remember seeing Sound of Freedom. It was such a big deal that was playing in theaters across the nation. So there's actually a really, really exciting film called The Relentless Patriot that is now, literally right now, in movie theaters today. You can go see it tonight if you wanted to. So here's the Fandango listing. Literally, I did 90210 you can see the Relentless Patriot. You can see it's in playing in movies. This is an incredible movie that highlights the life of Scott Lebedo as an artist that has been completely outcast from the artistic community, but he is standing strong, and what he stands for is absolutely incredible. So I'm going to go ahead and just play the trailer for it. It's a really, really inspiring trailer. I think you're going to enjoy it. But remember, this is out in theaters right now. So watch the trailer. Go check out your local movie theater listings. Find it playing. Go see it. Bring your friends. Bring families. It's one of the few movies that we can actually bring people to that they'll leave thinking, gosh, I should care more about this country. Or gosh, I'm thankful I live in such an amazing country. It's also the way that we should be supporting other patriot artists by going to see these films in theaters, because if enough people go see it in the theater, they'll keep it in the theater longer. It helps with the box office sales. It helps bring more money back into the movie studios that are daring enough to stand up against this entire system. So folks, here's the trailer for The Relentless Patriot.
11-month-old girl shot in the face because of woke criminal-loving district attorneys. Come on, murderer. This is a street performance.
Seems like all the artist activists are on the left. Except for Scott Lebedo.
I do not conform to the elitist isms of the art clubs, and they have left me like a redheaded stepchild. This is my medium in which I shall create, and this is my canvas, the front of the Brooklyn Museum.
The first most important thing in school or anywhere else is the Pledge of Allegiance.
This is not a pro-war protest. This has to do with the increasing level of anti-Americanism.
Now lock them up.
They don't keep the criminals in jail, they're not gonna keep you in jail.
This line is to show respect and honor to those who died, got shot in the fucking head, protecting us. You try to take that fucking blue line down. I'll paint it till the day I die.
When the towers came down, there was absolutely no doubt that feeling, it was gonna change my life. And it did.
When somebody's complaining, it's so cold out, you know, the traffic. And here I am, drinking with one of these guys who's got one arm, he's got a hook for another arm, and he's drinking a fucking beer, having a laugh with me, and he's not bitching about nothing.
I present to you the recipient of this year's VFW Americanism Award, Mr. Scott Lebedo.
That's it. I'm gonna paint a flag on a rooftop in every state near a military base.
As a veteran, we all fought for that flag in World War II. And today, we want to see it flying.
They will never, as long as I am alive, they will never take the American flag down. You wanna burn one? Then I will find out where you work, and I will find the building across the street and paint a flag 50 by 100, so you have to see it every fucking day.
A pro-Trump sign on the front lawn of a Staten Island home was burned to the ground.
The hate I get is astronomical. If everybody liked me, I'd be doing something wrong. My mother's advice, whatever you do with your life, as long as you believe it in your heart, and always take care of those less fortunate. My father's advice was, son, take from nobody.
This is about control and division.
We must unite. We must take a stand. Are you ready? Live, right, live.
God didn't give me a gun and a bayonet. He gave me paint and brush, and I will fight to the fucking death for this country.
Get on up. Get on up, ride left.
Folks, perhaps you'd agree with me when I say that over the past 5 years, the mainstream healthcare system's credibility has plummeted. Alternative healthcare systems that aren't beholden to medical consensus or big pharma are on the rise. Sweetamine is time-tested and proven to boost your life with better health. It's one of the leading products that helps with inflammation and daily aches and pains. Just because you get older, it doesn't mean you have to feel old. And folks, did you know that most of the diseases that make people sick and die these days are rooted in chronic inflammation, oftentimes due to glycine deficiency? So sweetamine is composed mainly of the amino acid glycine, the nutrient that the immune system uses to regulate inflammation. So with once daily sweetamine, most people feel the reduction in pain after just a few days. So I challenge you to the 12-day sweetamine challenge to fight inflammation and take control of your health today. So folks, buy sweetamine online at sweetamine.com or call 855-GET-SWEET. That's 855-438-7933, and make sure you use promo code SETH, SETH, to get a nice discount on your purchase.